On the 15th of July 1099, the Crusaders, as they would later be known, finally arrived in Jerusalem. Raymond de Guillier, a priest, described what happened next like this. He said some Muslims were mercifully beheaded, others were pierced by arrows fired from our siege towers, and yet others, tortured for a long time, were burned to death in searing flames. Piles of heads, hands and feet lay in the houses and the streets, and we rode in blood to the knees and bridles of our horses. That grisly, gloating, nightmarish image, though regarded as completely absurd by historians, is often quoted. For many, it encapsulates the crusading phenomenon as something shameful. For atheists especially, the Crusades are seen as proof that, at its heart, Christianity is irrational, repugnant. But what if we have it wrong? What if the Church is embarrassed by the Crusades because we've misunderstood them? Basically, the problem is this, that the story we tell ourselves is a myth. The true story of the Crusades doesn't begin with Western armies suddenly appearing uninvited in the Holy Land, but with the unexpected, unrelenting assault against what remained of the Roman Empire in the East by a whole succession of various Islamic states. For centuries, the Romans were able to repel the jihadists thanks to a number of factors: superb soldiers, genius generals, fantastic fortifications. They even had secret superweapons like so-called Greek fire. When the empire succumbed in France and Italy to the Franks and Goths respectively, the imperial heartland shifted to Asia, to what would become the country of Turkey. And so it seemed that the Romans might go on reinventing themselves again and again until Jesus returned. Yet that event, the end of the world, looked imminent in the 11th century. Yes, in 1094, when the Roman Emperor Alexios, based in the city of Constantinople, looked out across the Bosphorus to the far bank at Asia, he saw a sight to chill the blood. The Turks had arrived. He'd been fighting them his whole life, but they were like a human avalanche. There were hundreds of thousands of them, and they brought with them their herds of camels and goats, their children and their wives. Surely, this was Gog and Magog, finally come to destroy the new Israel, which is how the Romans regarded themselves. How did it come to that? Not all at once. The Turks had made for themselves an entrance into the empire a few years earlier, in August 1071 at the Battle of Manzanares, which was an unmitigated, humiliating military catastrophe for the Romans. It profoundly shifted the balance of power between Christians and Muslims in the region. Now, the reason for the Turks' success was multifaceted, as you might guess, but we can single out a couple of factors. Firstly, the way that the Turks fought with a short bow from the back of a stout pony was devastating. The Romans were often forced to charge through a hail of Turkish arrows to engage them at close quarters, which the Turks would avoid by galloping away. Secondly, the direction of their migration. The Turks, as indicated in the animation, came from the north through the Caucasus area. The Romans, however, usually called the Byzantines in this period, had been fighting the Arabs in the south for more than 400 years. Unwittingly then, the Turks had sidestepped the Romans' established fortified zone in Syria. They came in behind it, that is, above it, and so many of the cities they overran didn't even have walls. Consequently, there was extensive massacre in many places. Whole towns wiped off the map, all the men killed, all the girls and the women sold as slaves, many for sex work. Everywhere the infrastructure, aqueducts, roads and so on were vandalized and degraded. The empire was about to be annihilated. Alexios at first tried to talk to the Turks to make some of them his allies, but it was like negotiating with a murderously masochistic hydra that was willing to tear off its own heads. Whenever one of the many warlords agreed to make peace, induced to do so with a large chest of gold, he was poisoned by a more zealous rival or subordinate. And as if that wasn't bad enough, some of the Turks had begun experimenting with building boats. So Alexios decided to do something radical. One expert describes it as a desperate roll of the dice. He wrote a letter to the Bishop of Rome, the so-called Pope, a man he considered a heretic, summoning him to send help for what very well might be the last battle, Armageddon. Yes, if this was the apocalypse, Alexios intended to rage against the dying of the light, and there was no one better to have his back in this fight than the brutish Germanic nations squatting beside the Atlantic. He had employed these rednecks before. They had become a common sight in Roman armies: Saxons, Vikings, Normans. But he needed these auxiliaries now in unprecedented numbers. He also didn't have any money to pay them. He was broke. The streets of Constantinople were overflowing with starving refugees. The Westerners would therefore have to come for reasons of their own choosing, for ideological, non-material reasons. So he made his plea to them as brothers in Christ. The letter, conveyed by a team of diplomats, arrived during a church synod, a council meeting in the town of Piacenza in March 1095, and the Pope at that time, Urban II, was very pleased to receive it. He was deeply concerned by the situation in the Holy Land. Indeed, everyone was. Pilgrimage was an exceedingly popular thing to do in the early Middle Ages, but the occupation of Judea by various Islamic polities had made venturing to the places of Jesus' birth, crucifixion, and resurrection highly dangerous and extortionately expensive. An enormous expedition in 1065 was slaughtered despite having mercenary protection. Barely a quarter made it home alive. Furthermore, those pilgrims who did succeed were horrified by the destruction that they saw had been visited on the churches and the monasteries, thousands of which lay in ruins. The Christian population, though they remained the numeric majority, lived on a knife's edge, discriminated against, exploited, impoverished. A number of popes had already called for an intervention. Pope Sergius IV, for example, and Pope Gregory VII. Pope Theodore I was actually himself an exile from the Middle East, having fled persecution there. Someone needed to do something. After all, the Church has long taught that there are exceptional circumstances in which Christians, the saints, are called upon to make war because love of neighbor demands that we do so, to protect the vulnerable from a persistent aggressor. And what should be clear to you, I hope, is that the Turks and the holy war they were waging against the Romans qualified for a robust response. Thus, on the 27th of November, 1095, Pope Urban delivered a passionate, electrifying sermon reminding his audience that it was their duty as disciples to alleviate the crisis facing the beleaguered Romans. And he told them that if they did help, God would forgive their sins. It was an incredible, impossible thing to promise, but the crowds eagerly responded. Urban's message spread like the plague, that is to say, it went viral. Men and women of all classes signed up. All those who pledged to make the trip were told to sew a Red Cross cloth onto their clothing, and they were ordered to gather at Constantinople, where they were to make themselves available for whatever should happen next. And sure enough, when the main fighting force marched out from Constantinople against the Turks in the spring of 1097, it was an army under Roman imperial command, and a Roman fleet sailed along the coast to keep the army supplied as it marched and fought. There was simply no way it would survive by foraging. In addition, the Crusaders received support from the native Christian population at almost every step, who viewed these foreigners as liberators. Indeed, one scholar, having analysed the data as to the composition of the Crusader army, concludes that almost half were indigenous participants. Even with these local allies, however, the Crusaders were David in a contest against Goliath. The sources are consistently clear that they were heavily outnumbered by their Muslim opponents in battle after battle. Yet nonetheless, the Crusaders not only restored control of numerous ancient Christian cities to the rule of Alexios, they made it, as we heard, all the way to Jerusalem herself. And at Bethlehem, the whole city came out in procession with the relics and the crosses from the churches to welcome their rescuers and to kiss their hands. So as you see, the myth of the Crusades as an unprovoked colonialist project is precisely that, a myth, nonsense. A seeming colonialist reality unavoidably emerged, to be sure. That is to say, some of the leaders of the First Crusade, such as Godfrey of Bouillon and Baldwin of Bologna, established homes for themselves in the Holy Land, Crusader states. But honestly, these were absolutely necessary to preclude an immediate reversal of their hard-won victories. Had all the Crusaders simply returned directly home, having restored unrestricted pilgrim access to Jerusalem and so on, the culprits who had complicated Christianity in the area in the first place would simply have rushed back to refill the power vacuum and resumed their intolerant policies. Furthermore, nearly every crusader did return home. Just a minuscule number chose to remain. Of the 10 bishops who we know departed for the east on the First Crusade, for example, only one chose to remain in Judea, but as a cave-dwelling hermit. And as we reflect on these things, I personally have come to believe we can find much that is positive in the example of those volunteers who risked so much, enduring what was a pretty horrible experience: hunger, disease, brutal fighting, for the sake of others. And just as we look back with justified approval on our forebears who opposed the Nazis, so we too might consider that the Crusades, before they were later redirected elsewhere, were a remarkable, if alloyed, demonstration of well-intentioned self-sacrifice. Did you know that many crusaders bankrupted themselves utterly to participate? The cost of crusading was crippling, ruinous. Yet men like Godfrey and Baldwin sold everything to take part, so that the price of property in the West plummeted, and coin, hard currency, became scarce across the entire continent, because so much was being carried away to defend God's church in some pretty arid places. Who are we to condemn them? No. My challenge to you is this: that each of us should refuse to perpetuate the caricature of crusading, and to God be the glory.